All right, thanks. Again, my name's Ben Johnson. Bear with me a little bit. I just got off a red eye, so it's going to be a long morning for me. But excited to be here today. It's actually my third talk in the last 40 hours in 3 different cities. I actually prefer listening to folks like yourselves, but people keep signing me up for talks, so here I am. So today I just want to go through just some generic, security type issues. I do work for a vendor, but it's not a vendor pitch whatsoever. And so just real quick, so you know where I'm coming from. I got my start at NSA, moved over to a defense contractor called Mantech. Did a lot of fun stuff that I probably would have done for free, but they actually paid me to do it. A lot of more offensive type cybersecurity. It was great. But being a large defense contractor that's very services based, how do you grow? You hire a lot of people. How do you hire a lot of people? You lower the bar. And so a lot of us got frustrated and left. And so we went to a small startup that we made called Kairos, which is a half commercial, half defense company in the DC area. And we started doing incident response. We started getting calls during 2010 when China was hacking everyone, which they still are, right? But and these defense contractors would say, hey, we know you guys are security guys. Come on over, help us figure things out. And we said, all right. And we showed up and we said, where are your logs? And they said, here's our firewall logs and here's our Windows event logs. So they basically gave us nothing of value. And we had to do a lot of traditional forensics and all that, right? So we ended up creating a product, Carbon Black. Had a really good run there. Earlier this year, we merged with a company called Bit9, both in the endpoint space. And so I do have a couple computer science background degrees, and I'm a programmer and security guy by trade, so we can make this as technical as you want, or it can be as high level as you want to. And I'm kind of a LinkedIn junkie, so feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I love making connections. So you're going to hear buzzwords today, and I apologize for that. It's really because there aren't better ways to describe this, or at least I hope you guys can provide me some. But things like threat landscape, right? So there are these different types of threat actors, right? So, each one has its own target in mind, no pun intended. They operate differently. You get the criminal enterprises that are really after the, kind of get-rich-quick scheme, or maybe even a prolonged get-rich scheme. You have the hacktivists, who are, you're probably familiar with that, anonymous, or they're ideologists, or they have political motives, not necessarily trying to get rich. And the funny thing is, I did a lot of these slides for a webinar a few weeks ago, and I said, I'm not really running into hacktivists that much. And I should mention, so I was the CTO of Carbon Black. My new title at Bit9 is Chief Evangelist, which basically means I fly around and talk to folks like yourselves every week. So I'm in the field all the time. And so I was saying, I don't run into hacktivists much, and then literally that weekend, hacktivists took down Sony and a bunch of other video game companies, right? So I don't know if I had anything to do with that, but sure enough, it was a strange coincidence. And then you got the state-sponsored actors, right? Like China's the big one. You see stuff with Russia now because of US sanctions, sort of funneling, covertly funneling stuff like money and things to the Russian cyber criminals and things like that, right? But you really think of China when you think of the state-sponsored attacks, putting your actual military guys on it, that kind of thing. And so, you can go to these different sites that map out recent breaches. Not putting this up to scare you. I mean, you guys all know this stuff probably from headlines. But the thing I want to point out is a lot of companies don't have to report breaches. You really only have to report, and it's still kind of the pseudo requirement, if you have health information, if you have consumer records. But if you just are a big R&D company, or you're just building some technology with your own patents and stuff, you don't have to report a breach. And I go to all these companies that are breached, and they're never going to report it. And especially when sometimes their stock is at an all-time high, right? And so, you're probably just as sick of the headlines as I am, right? But a couple headlines did jump out at me in the last few months. And so the first was, I believe you heard Jeff kind of touch on it, but that cyber crime is more lucrative than the drug trade. Now, maybe I watched too many movies growing up, and I think of, suitcases full of cash and guys with machine guns and all this money. But it did shock me a little bit that cybercrime is believed to be more lucrative than the drug trade, right? And safer, right? You're probably not getting shot at as much. The other one was just a couple weeks ago, and this really shouldn't surprise me because everyone has unauthorized code in their environment. But the fact that 70% of our SCADA systems, our industrial control systems, have had breaches, right? We're talking about power plants, dams, that kind of thing, right? Stuff that we should get mad about. We should get mad about and really make a change, right? And if you thought about, like, you know, pick an industry, like a law firm. If people were walking out 70% of our law firms every day with documents physically, wouldn't we stop that? Wouldn't we do something about that? So we just all need to work together. We as vendors, partners, you know, guys in the trenches like yourselves, we gotta do better. And so you're gonna see me touch on kind of some subtopics. They're all related, right? But if we move into, you know I just touched on different threat actor categories, but if you really think about it, there's the opportunistic threat and not. What do I mean by that? So opportunistic threats have historically been the main problem, where they're just going after your computers. Whether or not that's something like CryptoLocker, where they don't care whose computer it is, they just want to, you know, get a ransom. Whether or not they're trying to get your computer so that they can use it for sending spam or just setting up a botnet, etc. Right? Those are the traditional, you know, opportunistic, and they're still out there, and they're still a pain. But there's these other guys that are, you know, more in the news now called advanced threats, and believe me, I want to throw up every time I say advanced threat, right? And if anyone has a better term for that, please tell me. You know, I've thought, you know, maybe targeted threats, tailored attacks, I don't know, precise threats or something. But they're really going after your data, right? So you used to just have to be better than someone else, like in the opportunistic sense. Like if you're think of a real store. If your store is harder to break into the guy next to you, they're probably just going to break into the guy next to you, right? That's, you know what, they're going to keep coming after you. And if you think about how you plot this, and I don't know how well you can see this, excuse me, but opportunistic threats on the top, they're really trying to maximize the slope, and that slope is the number of computers they infect plotted against time, right? And so what's going to happen is more researchers are going to get access to the tools. They're just going to get seen more and more, and then there's going to be more widely available signatures or whatever to, you know, to help detect these, right? But the other guys fly under the radar. They're trying to go after that one company that has what they want, or the partner of that one company, so they can kind of go in the back door. And so they're really trying to stay stealth. And regardless of how they get in, we need to detect it. We need to figure it out, right? We need to decrease something called dwell time, which you'll probably hear about more if you're working in security. It's really the time from when the attacker's in to when they're out. Right now it's about 243 days, which is terrible. You know, but you're trying to decrease the scope of the incident. If they're in there for 1 hour, they're probably on fewer machines than if they're in there for a day or a week or 5 months like we were talking about. And you're just trying to, you know, decrease damage. Like a big buzzword you're going to hear if you're not already hearing it is cyber resiliency, being able to take a punch and keep going, right? If Home Depot detected the first few machines infected, yeah, maybe they lost a few credit cards, maybe, but they wouldn't have lost 60 million or whatever it is, right? But I think, and this is where it's more interesting in this talk, is what are these guys doing once they get in? Well, there's this new term or new notion called living off the land. It's actually an old notion. Kind of hacking started by just using built-in tools. But you know, what do I mean by that? They get into your environment, whether it's through an exploit or through stealing credentials or whatever, and they're using just built-in tools. Valid Microsoft executables or whatever, right? It could be Linux or Mac or whatever, but they're using built-in tools. And so they have to do things like they have to execute code, right? If they're not doing something, you know, that in order to accomplish their goal, they have to run a program. They have to tell a computer to do something, right? And so they're guessing credentials, they're cracking them, they're you know, dumping them. They get in. You see this even with some malware, not necessarily human actors, but you see this with malware like Backoff is in the news a lot, where it's just trying to guess credentials. But once they get in, they're going to start, you know, copying data. Well, there's a ton of tools available in Windows, or, you know, I'm just going to pick on Windows, but there's a ton of tools available. Robocopy, Xcopy, you know, you can write your own scripts, etc. Again, so you're not introducing any new binaries, any new real code, right? Maybe a script or something, but they're using tools like that. You know, using known good tools to compress that data then too. Then they're exfilling it. They're sending it back to, let's say, China, for example, which is pretty much where everything's flowing. They're using just FTP, right? They're using net to mount your shares. They get credentials, they just mount a share like a user. And the title of this talk is hunting the outsider insider, guess what? Once they get credentials, that outsider is now an insider. That's the point, right? They are now an insider. So the cool thing is, if we can fix this, we get a 2-for-1. We get the insider threat and the actual external threat that acts like an insider, right? But it's a hard problem, and I'll keep talking about that. And so one really clever thing they're doing too, which it always sucks to say that the bad guys are clever, but they are. They push the envelope. Is what they'll do is they'll get in and they'll get credentials for like the local admin on that machine, and maybe they don't have any domain credentials. They'll pull down something like a compression utility like WinRAR or 7-zip or something that like is kind of interesting, but it's not necessarily malicious. But they're trying to just trip up your defenses just enough so that you have a human look at it. And then that sysadmin, that security guy logs in. Guess what? He just logged in with much higher credentials. Those are in memory. They grab those. Now they spread. They're doing this a lot, and it's pretty clever. They're really manipulating the environment, right? And that's the kind of the definition of the word hacker, right? From, it doesn't even have to be a bad guy, right? Is manipulating something, right? But they're manipulating the environment. And then they got to persist, right? They're going to add user accounts. They're going to hide in like the staging servers, the kind of dark places in your environment. They're going to create scheduled jobs so that even if you figure out that they added a user account, when you go home at midnight or whatever, they're going to re-add it through automated tasks and stuff, right? They're pretty clever. And guess what? They're well-funded, so that's why they have time to plan out all these. And so, you know, more things to consider. You know, there's just like tools like PowerShell, and if you're not familiar with that, I know we have a diverse audience in here. It's a very powerful tool in Windows that allows you to do too many things, basically. Another thing they do is they will actually, if they set up some sort of automated, you know, callbacks and tools, they will actually use your own blog or your own internal web server against you, where they can come from the outside, post some strange data in like a comment, and internally their code is looking at, their bot or whatever, is looking at that server. So it's never even leaving the environment to receive instructions. It's pretty clever as well. And then they're also doing stuff like, I'm just going to send all the data to Google Drive or Dropbox, or talk to a Twitter bot or something like that. So if you allow any of that, and I'm not saying you should ban all that, I'm just saying, you know, if you allow that, how do you detect what's normal and what's not, right? It's very hard. I'm not saying it's easy. And you know, and then also finally on this slide, they're trying to find, you know, hard-coded credentials. It's amazing how many jobs are set up or how many tasks to automate IT things. There's just plain text files with credentials to use, or hard-coded passwords that are shared across every box, right? So it's a tough problem. And Target, we were already picking on Target. They're kind of the whipping boy. They're actually doing a lot of good things at Target, but just happen to get hammered. You probably can't read this, but basically it says attackers mostly used general IT tools, protocols, procedures. Seldom do they use hacker-specific tools and malware. That's basically what I'm talking about. Like the hackers got in and they had some specific code to, you know, scrape memory and grab credit cards, but for the rest of it, they were really using Target's built-in software distribution system to push instructions to all of their point-of-sale systems. It's a tough problem. You really can't see this, but there is a nice blog. Happy to help find it for you if you talk to me after. It shows a nice kind of timeline and chart of what happened in the Target breach, so you can see how they actually did their thing. So if we want to hunt these guys, and I should say definitely ask questions. We'll have time at the end for us asking questions. So if we want to hunt these guys, how do we hunt it? And again, I'm not saying it's easy, but there are some things we can do. First of all, is your environment like this or like this? Who's more like this? Come on, be honest. Probably 80 to 90% of the companies I visit are like this. Everyone's going a different way on all sorts of networks. You did a lot of acquisitions, maybe it's not really your fault, it's just everyone has different IT or whatever. And then, how many actually think they're like this? So no one just wants to raise their hand, that's fine. You want to get here, right? And it's probably obvious, but the fact is, when you have a big mess, it's hard to figure out what's normal and what's not. And so what you're looking at here, and I don't know how well you can see this, is we took some real data, plotting processes and the domains they're connecting to, and how similar they are, what's their affinity to each other. And I don't know if you can see, the lower left-hand corner is green and the upper middle is blue. Those are your servers. They're pretty much just talking to each other, talking in the same domains. In the middle is this huge mess of your workstations, your desktops, your laptops. Right? It's just a mess. Even with this mess, if a server started connecting to some domains that no one had talked to before, that should jump out at you. And this is just one way to visualize data, right? But the point being seeing what's similar, what relationships there are. And so, talking about your environment, do you have a lot of vulnerable software running? Do you have a lot of entropy? The more mess you have or the more outdated stuff you have, it's going to be hard to hunt. I mean, it's going to be hard anyways. But the bad guys are going to use the lowest common denominator. If they can just use some simple thing in Metasploit, if you're not familiar, it's just like an open source, like red team tool, hacking tool. If they can just use some free stuff like that, they're going to use it. Why would you submit your $1 million state-sponsored exploit when you can just use a free open source thing and look like any kid in his basement, right? And so you have to try to clean up your environment and at least get some sense of normalcy before you can even attempt to, figure out what these advanced guys are doing. And again, they got to execute, they got to communicate, they got to grab data, they got to steal or add credentials, and they got to persist. And persist is a loaded word. They don't have to persist if they can get in easily, and we see that. They know they can get in again tomorrow if they need to, so they don't even try to persist, right? They don't even try to install anything to keep their access to that box, right? They just get in and stay as long as they can, and as soon as they get kicked out, they come in a different way or maybe the same way. And so, one thing to think about, and you're seeing this more and more in the community as a whole, and we preach this, right? But it's collecting more data. What happens a lot these days is you detect something and then you go try to collect data. Well, that thing might have been long gone by then. But if you collected data first and then did your detection, then you have all the data. It's kind of like, oh, someone's robbing 7-Eleven, let's turn on the security camera now. No, you record the whole time. And if you think about it as a industry, as a security industry, we've been very focused, especially on your endpoint, on your computer protection, as being, hey, when a new thing runs, is it known bad? No, or I don't know. I have to let it run, and I'm just going to ignore it from there on out. But there's all this activity that's going on, some of which I was talking about, that we should be able to detect. Strange user accounts, strange lateral movement, exfilling of data. Right? We all have to get better. We as a vendor, everyone in the community has to get better at detecting this stuff, right? And this is also the stuff that's going to help you detect insiders, right? Because they're already inside, but they start doing strange activity, and insider threat is a big hot item as well, And so, to put it a different way, if you think about, these could be security events. These are actually binaries. We used to have a website where you could almost play a game where you hover over each one, and it tells you the name of the binary and is it digitally signed or not and by whom. And you have to try to figure out which ones are good and bad, just based on this. I don't want to do that. That's like 100 binaries. I mean, it's a game, right? We did it for like a talk or whatever. But you start adding more information, and I think you'll like what you see. So you add reputation information. Now this could be from a site like VirusTotal of how many AV products think it's bad. This could be a detonation score. If you have like a next generation firewall, it gives you a ranking of how bad you think it is. Could be, threat intelligence is another word that makes me want to throw up, but it could be just what some company or what threat intelligence provider, what ISAC thinks about this binary or this event, whatever, right? But you keep going. So you add prevalence or frequency, or in this case, inverse frequency. So the more rare it is, the bigger the dot, right? So if it's red and it's big, assuming that malicious activity is rare, which might be a bad assumption, and then you're totally screwed. But a big red dot, big orange dot, you probably want to look at that first, right? Because it's all about maximizing human time. We all have way too few security people. I think the stat I've heard is for every 30 jobs, there's one qualified person in the security community. But you can keep going one more level, right? And it's relationships. So in this case, it's actually which binary wrote out which other binary. And so, up in the left here, you see a bunch of green around a yellow. Well, all the yellow it wrote out a bunch of green, right? And so I'm probably not gonna jump on that first, just assuming that, you know, the yellow is just either a bad classification, bad reputation information, or it's just maybe not as urgent. But when I start seeing clusters of orange and red, that's where I'd set my humans on first. That's where I'd set my analysts first, my SOC, my R guys, et cetera, right? And this is just for a talk, right? Like, not necessarily you'd look at the data like this, but the point is you see with relationships, and it really starts to show you where to focus your team. And so, you know, thinking about this in the context of hunting, you got to collect the right data, right? You got to collect the right data. If you don't have that, I mean, you know, it's kind of like if you don't log on the firewall, you're not going to detect any strange behavior going out to the network. Same thing with your computers or just, you know, other parts of your environment, right?